And what is that threshold, sorry?
That threshold is still to be advised by the Minister for Education, which we would expect to happen reasonably soon.
But presumably, because we know from what's been said, there's 110 schools, that's been worked on the basis of the assumption it's $7,500. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that's you'll note in the budget papers it does talk about the focus of the on roughly the top 15% of private schools. So, roughly about 85% of private schools are not affected by the initiative. So it will be sort of, it's at that higher end. The budget papers talk about roughly 15%, and the actual dollar threshold will be determined and announced by the Minister for Education.
I'm trying to understand that, because if we don't know the actual threshold, how can we come up with the figures that are produced in the budget itself?
Well, we obviously use a number to calculate our costings, and so the number that's been mentioned publicly of around that 7,500, 8,000 in terms of our costings is what drives the around 15%.
Okay, and just so I can understand it, so 7,500 to, let's say, 7,500. Does that include application fees?
It includes the fees that the school charges for tuition.
Tuition,
so the total fees.
Total fee. So it would include, say, for example, an application for school, because when kids go to a non-government school, they pay sometimes an application fee. It could be $100.
You're talking about the application that someone might
to attend
pay, yeah, what you might pay when your child is born.
Well, it could, when you're born, or it could be paid tomorrow for the school next year. You pay an application fee to the school.
I would probably have to check that, but my understanding would be no, it wouldn't include the the $100 application fee. It's focused on the tuition fees.
Okay. So what about the establishment fees? Because after you pay the application fee of $100, I know with some schools, for example, Acton College, for example, they charge a $2,000 establishment fee, which is not tuition per se.
Details to be settled with the Minister for Education.
So that would be part of the announcement that the Minister for Education would make in terms of not only defining the dollar threshold, but in a sense defining what would then be picked up in that threshold. So that announcement, recognising that this is to apply, and so schools will obviously need the announcement to be made reasonably soon. So we'd be expecting that would be occurring by the Minister, in the next short period.
Okay. I'm losing you a little bit, but what about building fund contributions?
Well, once again, this is about tuition fees.
But surely if you're contributing to a building fund, the very building in which we sit, we might be receiving an education, so presumably that could be included.
Well, as I said, the Minister for Education will be making announcements soon about the threshold, what's included in the threshold, to give the clarity for this initiative for both schools and parents of students at those schools.
And what about the library fund? Because, of course, books... What about the library fund? Of course, books are critical to tuition, so you wouldn't separate that from any definition to do with tuition. But would they be included, those fees?
Well, once again, it's, as I've just mentioned, it'll be part of the announcement that the Minister for Education will make about what the threshold is and what's actually covered in terms of things like, library contributions and school application fees, those sorts of things. To give
I suppose the difficulty here is if schools simply reduce their fee on one side of the ledger but actually increase either a library fee contribution or a building fee contribution or an establishment fee, application fee, we're going to be chasing our tails, aren't we?
Well, that's a valid point. You obviously don't want to introduce a system that is easy for schools to reallocate some of the fee component to something else. So that's obviously part of the announcement.
In the legislation.
So if you look at Division 5, Section 82 of the State Tax Amendment Bill, it does define subclause 4, for the purpose of subclause 3, the matters are the following: the fees and charges imposed by the school in relation to the provision of education, any other financial contribution received by the school, and any other matter that the Minister considers appropriate. So as I said, the Minister for Education will give clarity about the quantum of the threshold and what is included. And subclause 5 states, the Minister for Education, with the written consent of the Treasurer, may withdraw a declaration of further notice published in the Government Gazette. So that's covered in Section 82 of the State Taxation Amendment Act.
I think that'd be useful because obviously the $100 charge is a charge, so presumably that, from what you've just read, that it is included.
Well, it'd be important that clarity is provided. As I said, subclause 4, Part 3 will be, Part C, sorry, any other matter that the Minister considers appropriate. So that's something, that'll be part of the announcement by the Minister for Education.
With respect, Secretary, you've just told me that the fee isn't included, but now could be included. It sort of reminds me of the birthday cake and the GST back in the day.
No, but if you look at the legislation, and as I mentioned in one of my earlier answers, the key focus of this is on school tuition fees. So it's defined as the fees and charges imposed by the school in relation to the provision of education within the school.
But one would have thought the charge to enter the very school is very, by its nature, one of those fees and charges.
Well, if you're talking about the $100 that someone pays when their child is 1 year old, now I'm not the Minister for Education. I don't work in the Department of Education, but my assumption would be under clause 4C, any other matter, I would be somewhat surprised that a $100 payment 20 years before, 6, 7 years before a child or 10 years before a child enters a school would be considered part of the fee and tuition.
But I think what you're referencing perhaps is even the most elite schools. I know for my child, and forgive me, I'm a state school kid, so I'm not familiar with private schools or non-government schools or faith-based schools. But if my child wants to go to year 7 tomorrow at a private school or a non-government school, I can apply today. You don't have to wait 10 years. You just pay your $100 fee.
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends. It obviously depends on the nature of the school. Some schools have quite long waiting lists. Sure.
Not the school I went to, though. And the other thing that confuses me somewhat, again, I'm only a simple guy, but as I understand non-government schools, the fees change. So perhaps much less than it is for year 12. Mm-hmm. So how do you determine what school is a $7,500 fee-paying school?
There's been some public commentary made by government about, whatever threshold is set, that would obviously need to be adjusted as time moves forward.
So that confuses me now. So it may not be set. It might just be flexible, or it might just be at the whim.
No, it's set. The threshold gets set, but like a whole range of parts of the tax system, they get adjusted by governments each year. So
I'm following you. But we're talking about a $500 million revenue. That's what we're talking about. $500 million for this budget. Mm-hmm. And if it's based on a threshold that we don't even know whether it's a threshold or not, then surely that could represent a $500 million hole in the budget.
Not at all.
But you can't tell me what the threshold is.
I gave that answer a bit earlier, that the government has publicly said since the budget that the threshold is aimed at targeting those top 15, roughly about 15%.
Roughly. But we can't say what the threshold is with any certainty right now.
Well, we've factored in, obviously, a threshold to do our costing, but as I mentioned, the Minister for Education will come out publicly with the exact threshold. As per the legislation, it will focus on fees and charges and make it clear anything else that's included in that threshold.
I suppose the other thing that concerns me is there's talk of an exemption to this new application of the rule. So, but if there's an exemption, the assumptions don't allow for that in the budget papers.
No, there is an exemption. That's the other 85% of schools.
No, I understand that, but you're allowing this revenue from 110 schools for the near on. I'm rounding up to $500 million, but it's 421.
Yeah.
But let's round up. On that basis, that doesn't allow for a single exemption for any schools, notwithstanding it talks about that in the budget paper and it talks about that publicly.
Well, as I said, the policy is to focus on the top 15%. So you've already got the bottom 85 exempted. As you mentioned, the revenue forecast for this initiative is $422 million over 4 years. We've obviously done we obviously did the costing on that particular proposal, and now the government, through the Minister for Education, will come out and then announce what the actual threshold will be for the first year, and the Minister for Education will be making that announcement every year.
If I'm a school principal sitting here now, and I'm actually setting the fees now for next year, obviously, because we've got kids getting enrolled, showing interest in the school, how do I set the fees when I'm not quite sure, A, where the threshold is, but B, I'm not quite sure you understood the previous question. So for a preppy, for example, you might charge $5,000.
Yeah, but that's yeah. So
But
that's
for a
what-
year 12, you might charge $15,000.
No, I didn't say it though.
No, I'm putting that to you. So what would that school be?
But that's why you would expect an announcement reasonably shortly on the threshold for that very reason, to enable schools and parents to plan.
No, but my question really relates to how did you determine the revenue projections based on what?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we based it on the policy announcement of the top 15% of schools. And so the costing
Of schools based on what? Their
Based on
revenue,
fees.
their income, their...
based on tuition fees.
But how do you determine tuition fees if tuition fees vary across every year level?
That's right. So you take an average of the fees
Okay, now we're getting somewhere.
and
You average.
you calculate.
So someone has looked at every non-government school, looked at every fee they charge for every year level and provided an average for every school. Is that correct?
Sorry,
So someone in your department has looked at every non-government school and taken every fee at every level.
Well, I'm happy to, if Mr Barrett can fill in that
Sure,
gap on the
please.
costing.
No, just the method that was used for the costing is the ACARA definition, so Australian Curriculum. Sorry, I don't know what ACARA stands for exactly, but the actual definition that might be used.
So that's...
Minister Education might differ, but in terms of the modelling that we used, it's the ACARA definition.
So, I mean, if the public are listening to this and we can't even recall what the acronyms stand for, and this is a $500 million take from the community, because ultimately parents pay for this, right?
Well, I don't know that it matters.
It'd be great to have an explanation. Was it a list that you received and that those schools therefore just targeted, they're the EU 15%? I'm trying to understand how we came up with this 15% of so-called top tier schools or
Well,
elite
as I just
schools.
answered, it's a definition by ACARA.
Explain to me what the acronym of ACARA is.
I don't think it matters what the acronym is.
Well,
Go and look at it.
No, but that's the,
Well, hang on, but with respect, taxpayers are paying a lot of money for education. They're putting their hands in their own pockets, and you want to sit here and you want to tell me that you don't even know what that means.
now what Mr Barrett is explaining is the methodology we use, and obviously we get information, like any costing, we get relevant information from relevant departments.
We don't know what it stands
ACARA, who we
for.
don't know what it stands for.
to help us do a costing. So, of course, we based a costing on the policy intent that the government made a decision on, which was to focus on the top 15% of schools, and that's what the $422 million costing is based on.
But I need to remind you both, I mean, we're relying on the civil servants of this state to provide the most robust advice to government to ensure that any policies that are implemented actually have and serve the public's interest. But if you're sitting here and you can't even tell me what the acronym stands for, and we're talking about thousands of dollars ripping it out of the system for every parent. Do we know what the acronym stands
Well,
for?
I can tell you what the acronym stands for. I'm not in the education department, but it is the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. I don't think that that's what matters. It's a very well understood measure in the education portfolio.
What I'm trying to understand for all the parents who are about to be asked to pay for this is how you came out with the determination that these 115 schools would be targeted by this tax.
No, but I think we're sort of confusing different concepts here. The decision the government has made is to remove the payroll tax exemption, not for every private school, but for the top 15% of private schools. That's the decision that the government has made, and that's as articulated in the budget papers. So the costing in the budget papers of $422 million reflects that policy decision that the government has made.
Well, there's also some discussion about indexation. So indexation based on what, CPI?
Well, as I said, the Minister for Education each year will make a decision on what the threshold is.
So the minister could double it next year.
Sorry?
The minister could double the threshold next year.
The Minister, yeah, that's not set in legislation that it's going to be X forever.
Yes, so the minister could double it. So
That's right. The Minister and the government through the Minister could adjust the threshold further than indexation each year.
and how
They're
the
choices that future governments will make.
and how are the hundreds of schools supposed to plan for their future when they don't even know what their exposure will be to this tax?
That's why I said early in one of my answers, my expectation with the Minister for Education would be making an announcement shortly on what the threshold is for that very reason, to help schools plan.